Okay, hello everyone. Sorry for the late start. I posted on the, just before we go any further, before I say anything else. I don't know if anyone had a chance to look at that, but I posted on the WhatsApp group the Evan Hazel in Perik Yud of the Rambam, which I came across a couple of days ago. And the Evan Hazel, Baruch Hashem, really learns the Rambam pretty much as we did, exactly as we did, in fact, and understands the Rambam to be saying that Makkeh BePatish, the core chiyuv of Makkeh BePatish is Makkeh BePatish, smiting with a hammer blow, and that's not necessarily a melacha which is at the Gemara. That's not necessarily a Gemara melacha, and every other Gemara melacha is also a tolda of Makkeh BePatish. So perhaps to contextualize this, let's try and work through the Mahalchim in how to read this phrase of the Gemara. Makkeh BePatish, Rabbi Zobin, Amu Shavayu, Komidi to Isbe Gemara Melacha Chayv Mishum Makkeh BePatish. So I already pointed out that this phraseology is a little strange. It could have just said Makkeh BePatish Hainu Gemara Melacha. If the Gemara wanted to say that the definition of Makkeh BePatish is Gemara Melacha, then the Gemara could have said that. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say the definition of Makkeh BePatish is Gemara Melacha. It says rather Kol Midi to Isbe Mishum Gemara Melacha. Anything which has a Gemara Melacha, which is a Gemara Melacha, is Chayv Mishum Makkeh BePatish. It's Chayv because of Makkeh BePatish. So there's a number of answers to that question. Rashi's answer to the question is that only the melacha of Makkeh BePatish is the Av, and perhaps also, or not perhaps, and also Chatzivas Evan, hewing or quarrying the stone off the mountain. Those are the Av melachas. And every other Gemara is a Tolda. That's what Rashi says in Kuf Beis. So that's Rashi's answer to the question that Chatzivas Evan and Makkeh BePatish literally are the Av, and other Gemara Melacha is a Tolda. That's Rashi's answer to the question. The Rambam's answer to the question is similar to Rashi but different. The Rambam's answer to the question is only Makkeh BePatish is the Av Melacha, and perhaps also other Maisa Uman, any actualization or expression of a craftsman-like activity, and Gemara Melacha is a Tolda of Makkeh BePatish. That's the Rambam's answer to the question. As we saw in the Rambam in Yud Halacha Tesayin, which the Rambam says, Makkeh BePatish hakar achas chayev, charois yodova shegemara melacha is a Tolda of Makkeh BePatish. So that's how the Rambam learns this phrase in the Gemara. No one, by the way, lines up the sugya in the way I'm doing. In other words, I'm lining up the sugya as if the whole conversation is going on. How do we translate this strange phrase of Rabbi and Rav Zera of Kol Midi Isbe Mishum Gamalacha Chayv Mishum Makkeh BePatish? But to me, I found this a helpful way of lining up the sugya of how each Rishon reads that phraseology. And we now come to a third Rishon on the sugya. There's another explanation, I think, of this phraseology. And this is the Me'iri. We've looked before at the Me'iri, but I want to look at the Me'iri again, and I printed it in the handout sheets as the source for the base of Bechira. Even though I'm calling it the Me'iri, of course, is a quotes. The Me'iri doesn't say himself, he quotes. And the Me'iri here is quoting the Chachmei Hadoros. I don't know who these Chachmei Hadoros are. One of the difficulties with learning the Me'iri is that the Me'iri gives pen names or titles to the sources he quotes, and he doesn't always tell us who they are. Sometimes the titles are intuitive and sometimes not. He quotes Chachmei Hadoros. I'm not sure who these Chachmei Hadoros are, the wise ones of the generations. But what do the Chachmei Hadoros say? Well, let's read it inside because I struggled to understand the Me'iri. But I think I know what the Me'iri means. The Me'iri says as follows: the Chachmei Hadoros, Shonim Bar Kahogin, they ask on the Gemara that v'yischayv ba mishum Makkeh BePatish, that you should be chayav because of Makkeh BePatish. K'shmeish Amri Perik Kal Gadol, Manda Shokol, etc. He quotes the Gemara Shokol Gima, chayav mishum Makkeh BePatish. So the question is, every time you write, finish a book, you should be chayav because of, not just because of the Kosev, but you should also be chayav because of Makkeh BePatish. Answers the Chachmei Hadoros in the Me'iri. Shelo nema Makkeh BePatish edel b'melacha nishlama kula, or nishma kula, where it's completely finished. Could go into Chotzav Evan Bahar. The nisparka kula or kula misfiraseh, it's completely separated. An Evan is hewed from the mountain. The stone is hewed from the mountain. It's completely separated from its surroundings. The nimtza shenishlamar melachas Evan. The work of the Evan is finished. El shenil nofla. It hasn't yet fallen. V'zeh Makkeh BePatish mapila. This one hits it with a hammer and it falls. The melacha in the guf oisadova, in the body of the actual thing, is already finished. That's the definition of Makkeh BePatish. Then he says, that's the Gemara that we had earlier on our Omud, on Ayin Hey Omud base that we're learning, where you remove these threads or whatever it is from the garment. So the Meiri says the same principle over there. Let's have a look at the Gemara. This is the Gemara that we saw before. Haiman de Shokala Kufi Miglima, Chayv Mishum Makkeh BePatish. So there's some sort of removing threads which are hanging from the garment, whatever exactly the explanation may be. Says the Meiri, why are you chayiv there? Because Shara Glima Kula Suya. The garment is completely made. The garment's fully made, full stop. But with the case where you write the letters in the book, or the case of the weaving, the garment or the book aren't yet finished. Anything you do, the Tzorech HaShlama, Eino Makkeh BePatish, is not Makkeh BePatish. If not so, even the melachos where the beginning and the end are coming together, like harvesting, for Makkeh BePatish. So I think what the Meiri is saying is that Makkeh BePatish is only when the object itself is finished, and he seems to be trying to have his cake and eat it a little bit. The object itself is finished, but he says nonetheless, Makkeh BePatish, there's still something missing. So he seems to be saying the object itself is completed, but there's something that needs to be removed, some little side element of it that needs to be removed. So the even, the stone is completely hewed from the mountain, but it hasn't yet fallen off, it hasn't yet been detached. So Makkeh BePatish is the blow that makes it fall off the mountain. Or the garment is completely finished, but just has some threads hanging, so removing the threads hanging, that's Makkeh BePatish. He seems to say that has to be that the melacha beguf oisadava kavar nishlama. The melacha in the body of the thing itself is already finished. So I don't know exactly how to quantify the border line that the Meiri is drawing over here, but he seems to be saying that if you're doing an act of making something, that's not Makkeh BePatish, even though through that making, the melacha is finished. The object is finished. Makkeh BePatish is when you have a finished object in front of you, and you just somehow complete it, that's Makkeh BePatish. But where you don't have a finished object, where the act itself is finishing the object, that isn't the melacha of Makkeh BePatish. And therefore he says anything the beginning and the ends come together. In other words, the action I'm doing is not just the completion of the object, but also the beginning of the object. That won't be Makkeh BePatish. And with this, he answers the question: why isn't every other scenario a melacha? Every time you bake a bread, every time you harvest grain, stalks, every time you finish the last letters in the book, why is it Makkeh BePatish? The answer is because the last letters I'm writing are finishing the book. So I've written the letter, the book's not finished. Makkeh BePatish is when it is finished and I'm just completing it, removing the impediments, fixing up the last problems that are there. Now, the Meiri sounds a little bit paradoxical. How can it be that for the bigger activity, which is finishing something, you're not chayiv, and for the smaller activity, which is just removing the final threads of the object or something like that, you are chayiv? So I don't know exactly what the answer to this paradox is, other than the Meiri seems to be saying that the melacha of Makkeh BePatish is when you are fixing something, tweaking something, when it's already got the chashivas, the significance of being the object itself. When it doesn't yet have the chashivas, when it doesn't yet have the significance of being the object itself, and it's just completing, making something isn't the melacha of Makkeh BePatish. Manufacturing something new isn't the melacha of Makkeh BePatish. The melacha of Makkeh BePatish is when I have something and I'm matucking it, I'm fixing it or sorting it out. Makkeh BePatish isn't manufacturing or making something. I'm struggling over here to understand exactly the definition. I mean, surely it's a kal v'chomer. If finishing something is the melacha, when it's already made and I'm just fixing it up, how can it be that making it and manufacturing it isn't the melacha? But nonetheless, this is what the Meiri is saying from the Chachmei Adoros.
Isn't this logic saying that that's exactly why it's a separate malacha, and as opposed to what we said the other day, I can't remember in whose name, but otherwise every time you finish a malacha, you're chayav two malachas, the malacha itself and Makkeh BePatish. So he's saying the complete opposite of that, the polar opposite, that it's literally a malacha on its own.
You're correct and you're not correct, Max. It is true that there's a question over here. Why am I not chayav for every malacha also for Makkeh BePatish? And we'll get to that question. And it may be that there are figures who answer that question by saying, as soon as you're chayav from another malacha, you're not chayav for Makkeh BePatish. And that may be a good answer to the question. But that's not the engine that's driving the Meiri, because the Meiri doesn't say that. He doesn't say the point is that you're chayav from another malacha and therefore you can't be chayav for this malacha. The Meiri says it's a svara that Makkeh BePatish is fixing it when you already have the thing. If I'm doing something in the guth, the body itself isn't finished, then that's not Makkeh BePatish.
I'm trying to work out whether the reading of the Gemara supports or goes against his argument. The Isbe Gemara Malacha.
So I think we now have a third reading in the Gemara. I think the Meiri again is coming from this language, and the Meiri is saying that anything which has a Gemara Malacha is chayav mishum Makkeh BePatish. That means the object is already finished, and this is just the completion of it, or the last straw. But if it's making it, then that wouldn't be the malacha. And the Aruch HaShulchan, which I referenced, I'm not going to go through the Aruch HaShulchan inside, but on page 3, source 10, I printed the Aruch HaShulchan. The Aruch HaShulchan seems to think that the Meiri and the Rambam are going with one view. I don't understand that part of the Aruch HaShulchan, so I'm not completely at ease with everything the Aruch HaShulchan says. But one thing I got out of the Aruch HaShulchan, which is he effectively says a view like the Meiri, and he says this is Maduk in the language of the Gemara, that I think a third reading in the language of the Gemara, Kol midi de iske ben Gemara malacha chayav mishum Makkeh BePatish. But if it's manufacturing not, if it's Gemara, yes, manufacturing not. That's how the Aruch HaShulchan is Maduk in the language of the Gemara, which seems to be in accordance with the view of the Meiri.
Can I just clarify? I understand about the glima, that you've got a complete object. We just didn't quite understand about the ketiva. When you've got the last thing in the sefer, there's something else you need to do to make a sefer? You've got to glue it together, or is that what is implied?
No, the Meiri's not saying that. He's saying this is indeed, it's finished. But since it wasn't finished till I wrote the last letter, but this is not Makkeh BePatish, this is completing it. And that's not called Makkeh BePatish. The sefer over here, don't picture a bound book, picture a scroll, a Megillah.
Yeah.
As I write the last letter, it's now finished, that's it. Asks the Meiri, in that case, as I write the last letter, surely it's also Makkeh BePatish. Answers the Meiri paradoxically, no. Makkeh BePatish is once it's finished and I'm just fixing it. But here, where it's not finished till I write the last letter is the making of the object, not the fixing of the object, and therefore that's not Makkeh BePatish.
Yeah.
Could it be that it's not really about... Oh, sorry, Paul. Sorry.
No, I'm just saying, he's saying, Lo nishlam ha-sefer ha-beged, I say before the last letter.
Yeah.
Could it be that it's not really about tweaking? Tweaking only makes sense in the case of the cloak, really, but it's more about, like he says, the goof of the thing is done, right? And for some things that you might want to make, after the thing is done, there is another step which then puts it into effect in the world, right? Or maybe that's too strong in the case of the cloak, but there's a finishing act, there's a ta-da moment, there's I don't know what it is, right? A kind of an action on the end, and that doesn't apply in some cases. It does apply in others, right? So it does apply in the case of hitting the stone off the mountain or taking the threads off the cloak. But sometimes it's just not there, right? If you're writing a scroll, that is the last letter is the last thing, and you're done. So Makkeh BePatish, according to the Meiri, is a, for some things there's another action which is the last action of a process, and that is that's what he's arguing that it is.
Yeah, it could be. When we looked at the Meiri the first time several months back, I thought that's what the Meiri was saying. That the point is that some things you just do and do and do and do till they're finished. Therefore, there's no significance to the last blow. The last act you're doing is just the last act you're doing. You do and do and do. You do the same act again and again and again and again. And eventually, when you've done it enough times, the object is manufactured. Makkeh BePatish has to be where there's a specific finishing off act. And that would be a nice pshat actually, that the chashivas of Makkeh BePatish is that there's a finishing off act as opposed to just everything that you're doing all the way through. I don't see that anymore in the language of the Meiri though, and that's why I've backed off that pshat. It doesn't seem to me a good read in the Meiri, but it seems to me a very geschmack svara. It's a very understandable svara that where there's a specific last act, which is qualitatively different to everything I've done beforehand, that's Makkeh BePatish. If all I'm doing is do the act again and again and again and again, and eventually I've done it enough times and I've finished it off, then that's not Makkeh BePatish. I love the svara. I just no longer see it in the language of the Meiri.
Rabbi, I didn't quite catch how you read how the Meiri reads the Gemara. When it says Kol Midi de Ispe Gemar Malacha, could it be that he's reading it anything that's got a Gemar Malacha, i.e. any item that has already been finished off, like how we read the Meiri, on that you can be Chayav Mishum Makkeh BePatish?
Maybe that wasn't how I was reading it, but you may be right. Let's have a look at Aruch HaShulchan and see how the Aruch HaShulchan says it. You know what's interesting? Having heard Josh's comment and looking at the Aruch HaShulchan, it does look to me that like the Aruch HaShulchan is saying Josh's version of the Meiri, as opposed to what I think the Meiri himself is saying. The Aruch HaShulchan, by the way, doesn't quote the Meiri. He just says it as his own story. Look at the maybe we should read the Aruch HaShulchan inside. Let's look at the Aruch HaShulchan. It's on page 4. Let's look at Sifir Daled. Sifir Daled. Aval im kain eine move mash omer b'Gemara Rabbi Zobin omer shavayi. So he's asking on the language of the Gemara. Kol midi the ispe Gemar Malacha chayav mishum Makkeh BePatish v'kosher. Al b'chol Malacha yesh Gemar Malacha. U'ma zeh kol midi the mashma sheyesh Malacha she'ein behem Gemar Malacha. Anything which has a Gemar Malacha is chayav. So he doesn't understand the lashon, and therefore in Sif Tezvav he says, "U'be'emes nu and anu yastati." He doesn't quote this in Meiri. Shekenu v'achiv roshi. Shekol Malacha she'ein b'Gemar Malachta pa'ula nifredes me'akodem. Anything where in the completion of it, there isn't a separate action from that which came previously, is not called a Gemar Malacha. It's all one Malacha. The finishing act is no different to the early act. But Malacha is where the finish of the action, the Gemara, is after the finishing of the main part of the Malacha. In these cases, Zero Makkeh BePatish, that's Makkeh BePatish. So I think the Meiri, the Aruch HaShulchan is saying akin to the Meiri, that's only where the thing is finished, and then I do something else to finish off. That's the Malacha. But actually, in having re-looked at the Meiri now as a triggered by Ed's question, I think he is saying Josh's svara. So sorry, let's just pause so we don't end up confused. The language of the Gemara, Kol Midi to Ispe Gemar Malacha chayav mishum Makkeh BePatish, bothers us. It should bother us, and it bothers the Aruch HaShulchan. And Aruch HaShulchan specifically asks what's going on with this language. Now, they're two similar but different svaras that it seems to me are being said over here. The Meiri says that it's only the Melacha Makkeh BePatish if it's something which is finished, and now I'm just fixing it up. But when I'm making something, that's not Makkeh BePatish. That's manufacturing. That's not Makkeh BePatish. The Aruch HaShulchan says a slightly different svara, more like the svara that we're calling Josh's svara now, which is that where I just make and make and make. I do and do and do a certain action, and eventually, when I've done it enough times, I've finished doing the action. That's not Makkeh BePatish. That's just doing and doing and doing the action, writing letter till I've written enough letters and I've finished it, and that's the Malach, and that's Melachas Kosef, and with that the book is finished. Makkeh BePatish is only where there's a specific action which I'm doing after I've finished making something, and now there's a unique and different action which is the finishing act. That would be Makkeh BePatish. Says the Aruch HaShulchan, that now reads in brilliantly into the language of Gemara. Kol midi to isbe Gemar Malacha. Anything which has a specific final action, chayav mishum Makkeh BePatish. But anything which doesn't have a specific final action, but is just a continuation of the manufacture till it's finished, I make the object till I've made enough of it, and then it's finished. That's not called Makkeh BePatish. So I think that's a beautiful reading of the Gemara in the Aruch HaShulchan.
The only problem I had with that is that the Aruch HaShulchan says Where he says Gemar Ika Malacha. He doesn't say Gemar Malacha, he says Gemar Ika Malacha. So that implies maybe there's an element of you've still got to do a bit of a Gemar on it, not that it's the whole Malacha's completed. He says Gemar Ika Malacha.
Yeah, I don't see a way of resolving that paradox, which is, look, the Meiri is saying you've finished the object, but there's still something, there has to be still something left to do, otherwise it's not Makkeh BePatish. So you'll finish the Malacha, but the Meiri says you finish that which is in the Guf HaMalacha, which is in the Guf HaTov, in the body of it. And then it sounds like I'm removing a side issue. So for example, weaving, you're finished making the Guf HaTov, you've made everything you need to make. However, you now need to cut off the hanging threads, that's Makkeh BePatish. If you're still making it, then that's not Makkeh BePatish. That's what I'm understanding the language to mean, I think.
But the Gemara says the Isbei Gemar Malacha Chayav as if you. I mean, are you reading it like if you got a malacha where there is an end to the malacha, as it were, then automatically you're Chayav Makkeh BePatish? I mean, that's a bit of a hard reading because it should say you're Chayav Makkeh BePatish if you do such and such. Surely.
The Meiri says, the Gemara is saying a rule. Anything where there is a specific ending act, you're chayav, Mishra Makkeh BePatish. Anything where there's no specific ending act, it's just manufacturing until you're done enough, then you don't do Makkeh BePatish. Is that Max, you're not happy with it?
Well, so you're automatically chayav Makkeh BePatish if the malacha that you've done has got an end in the malacha.
No, that's got an end. There's a specific completing act, different to everything that came before it. If it's just doing the same again.
Oh, right, so that's the opposite of what I was reading it. So yeah. The Gemar malacha is referring to a different malacha from what the rest of the malacha was.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. You and Edgar were not. Your deal was not like the Aruch HaShulchan. Saying the other way around.
Right.
Anything where there's a specific final completing act, that would be Makkeh BePatish.
Right. Different from the
acts that preceded it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, are you suggesting that the Meiri will say because it's for the stone hewing, because the final act is actually the same as all the other acts, like you smacking it with a hammer? Actually, but for him, he would say, well, that act is, even though you've done the same thing, what happens is different. In this case, the stone falls off. That's what makes it become a Makkeh BePatish. It's not in the goof of the object anymore. There's also you've got this added thing that you've done, which is hitting it off the mountain.
Correct. The Meiri is saying a subtly different Torah. The Meiri is saying, because the Guf HaTov is finished, I've made everything that needs to be made, and all I'm doing now is removing it or separating it or trimming off the threads. That's what makes it Makkeh BePatish.
I'm struggling to see the distinction between that and what you're saying is the Aruch HaShulchan. I see it in the Aruch HaShulchan. I don't understand what's different about the Meiri.
If I'm reading the Meiri correctly, and that's a big if, I'm not sure I'm right or wrong, but I think this is what the Meiri is saying. The Aruch HaShulchan is saying a svara that if the action I'm doing, the Makkeh BePatish is when there's a discrete, separate sort of finishing off action. So with a book, I write letter. Eventually, I write the last letter, the book's finished. But that's just the final piece of manufacture. That's not Makkeh BePatish. It's a very nice svara. The Meiri, I think, is saying a different svara. The Meiri is saying that Makkeh BePatish is something that takes place after an object is made. And I'm just fixing it, tweaking it, putting a gloss on it. That's Makkeh BePatish. But if the object isn't yet made and I'm making the object, that's not Makkeh BePatish. So Makkeh BePatish is only in a made and finished object. I tweak and fix a made and finished object, that's Makkeh BePatish. If the object's not yet finished and I'm finishing it, that's not Makkeh BePatish, that's manufacturing.
But it's just, I get that in the case of the cloak, it just seems hard to argue that that's what's happening with the stone, right? It's not a tweak, it's taking the whole thing off the mountain, right?
I don't know. Maybe the Meiri means it's already completely detached from the mountain and I'm just causing it to fall. I don't know what the Meiri means. The Meiri might mean detached from the mountain already.
On that point, I'm going to make some point. I was learning with Edgar before, and he made the point that the way the Meiri's written it Misrapeket or Nispakra Kula Mitzvah suggests that it's already cut off the mountain and only has to be pushed down. It's different from the wording of Rashi, who says that it's the Misrapeket for Nofeles. Afterwards, Misrapeket for Nofeles, whereas here he says it's already completely separated and only has to be pushed down. It's not my point, it's Edgar's.
I absolutely agree with you, and this is
Not me,
right.
it's so therefore, it seems very clear that it's completely separated from the mountain.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think you're correct. It seems to me the Meiri is saying it's detached and it's just pushing it off the mountain, and that's the point of the Meiri, that the melacha beguf oisadova kvar nishlama, the melacha in the body itself is different. I was going to come to your point in a minute or two, and I will still come to it, not today actually, which is I agree with you. I think Rashi, both here and the Rashis we've seen already on Ein Hayomad base and Ein Daladon base, radically disagrees with the Meiri. The Rashi has a completely different reason. The Rashi thinks that anything that finishes it off is chayiv, and he disagrees with the.
It has a different Matthias as well.
It has to be a different Matthias, absolutely.
It's not my point; it's Edgar's point.
I'm agreeing. The Meiri seems to be saying, sorry, Josh, you just speaking. The Meiri seems to be saying a different point. The Meiri seems to be saying that you're only chayev because the even, the hewing is finished, and all you're doing is pushing it off, nofla, and therefore that would make it Makkeh BePatish because the body, the work in the body of the thing has been done.
It's not just the hewing's been finished; it's been removed from the mountain, and then it has to be pushed down afterwards. The loss of Misrapka is different in Meiri than it is in Rashi.
No, Henry, I agree with you.
Okay.
I'm just saying the Metzias, I don't know if you're taking the Metzias too far. The Meiri is saying it's hewed off the mountain, but it hasn't yet been nothal. I don't know if that means it's separated or it's just, I assume it's a rock, so it's still very tightly pressed against the bottom of the mountain.
But I think it has been separated because the way that this parakah in the Meiri is different from where it is in Rashi.
Again, to me, leave Rashi for we'll get to Rashi next time. Just let's go in the language of the Meiri. We will get to Rashi. The point in the Meiri is that I agree with you. Rashi disagrees with me. We'll get to Rashi also soon. The point in the Meiri is that the melacha has been done, and the guf hadova is finished, and all you're doing now is as the Meiri says, that is causing it to be nofal off the mountain. I'm not interested in a debate now about whether it's physically separate from the mountain or it's pressed against the mountain. It doesn't interest me. The point is that the melacha is finished according to the Meiri in the guf hadava, and therefore what you're doing now is Makkeh BePatish. So in the Meiri, we have to bite the bullet that there's a paradox over here. That if I'm manufacturing the object, it's not the melacha Makkeh BePatish. If the object is already made and I'm just being mesuck in it, I'm just fixing it, then that is Makkeh BePatish. That's that seems to be the point of the Meiri. Rashi, as correctly pointed out, both there in Kuf base, it seems to say that the final hammer blow is detaching it from the mountain. And we'll see next year in the glass blowing scenario and in Ein Daled on the base, and all those three places and other Rashis which we haven't learned and therefore I'm not going to mention, seems to consistently not accept this nuance in the Meiri, and seems to say that even if the final blow is completing the object, completing the manufacture of the object, that's enough to say that you're chayiv. Josh, does that answer your query? Are you happy with that? Or?
I'll reread the Meiri. I'm still confused about what he is. I understand what you're saying that he's not saying, but I'm struggling to see what he is saying now. Again, the thing
I'm also
is,
struggling to understand the numbers of this. It sounds paradoxical, but this is what he seems to be saying.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I need to reread it.
Okay. Fair enough. Okay, so Rabbi Zobin will finish there for today, and in Hashem on Sunday we'll continue in trying to create the last hammer blow in the Melacha Makkeh BePatish and understand what's going on over here. Yeah,
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Take care.